Good afternoon. This is Paul Tiao. Thank you very much for joining us. I think we're going to get started now. Welcome to the webinar on the Safety Act, Security and Insurance, Protecting Your Reputation and Reducing Liability Risk. I'm co-chair of Hunton's Cyber and Physical Security Task Force and a member of our Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. Over the past 5 years, a significant amount of my work has included advising companies on risk management, preparedness, and cyber incident response, and is specifically in relation to the Safety Act. So a few administrative notes. Please note that we will be recording the webinar to make available to everyone after the webinar. So should you have any questions throughout the program, please use the chat feature on your screen to type your questions, and we'll try to answer your questions as we go along, or if time permits, we'll address questions in Q&A at the end. Let me take a minute now to introduce our speakers for this session. It's a terrific panel of folks that can speak to all aspects of the Safety Act. So we're hoping that you're going to get a sort of broad view on the different dimensions of the Act, how it can be used, and how it actually works. Kevin Jones is a partner in Hunton's Richmond and New York offices. He's co-chair of our Cyber and Physical Security Task Force with me, and he advises clients on matters related to physical and cybersecurity, including preparedness and risk management, the Safety Act, regulatory compliance, incident response, and stakeholder relations. Lorie Masters is also a partner with me at Hunton's DC office. She's a nationally recognized insurance coverage litigator who handles all aspects of complex commercial litigation and arbitration. Lorie has advised clients on all types of liability coverages, including insurance for cyber and physical liabilities, and she has done groundbreaking work on the Safety Act. We're also pleased to have Bruce Cohen and Dave Wong with us. Bruce is client executive in insurance broker Lockton's Washington, D.C. office. Bruce works with complex clients to further their corporate and risk management objectives, principally in the government contracting, technology, professional services, and manufacturing industries. Cyber and technology errors and omissions exposures are increasingly a threat to his clients, some of which utilize the Safety Act protections to mitigate these and related liability risks. So Bruce is going to be able to provide some very interesting practical perspectives on the Safety Act and the insurance context, and we'll also be providing a piece on sort of the current cyber insurance market with Lorie at the end. Dave Wong is a managing director at FireEye Mandiant. He manages the FireEye Mandiant Cybersecurity Consulting practice in North America. They're well known as one of the best in the country, if not the best. In this capacity, he leads and oversees projects to help organizations respond to cybersecurity incidents and make them more resilient to attack. Over the past 10 years, he has investigated some of the very largest cybersecurity incidents known to man, or people, and provided evidence to help law enforcement and arrest criminals. So it's an all-star lineup of folks, and they're going to be able to provide some terrific insights and perspectives into the physical and threat risk environment as well as the Safety Act. So now the roadmap is first we're going to start with a description of the cyber threat landscape that Dave will provide, and then a physical security threat landscape from Kevin. I will provide some background on the Safety Act and the different types of awards or protections you can get under the Safety Act, and I'll be doing that with Lorie Masters. Kevin, Dave, and Bruce will talk about sort of the practical benefits of the Safety Act award. Lorie and I will jump back in to talk about what it means to get legal protections in the event of an act of terrorism. I'll be talking about the application process, and then Bruce and Lorie will close in the last half of the session with a description of the cyber insurance sort of market. It's fast evolving, and then some practical tips on how to get insurance coverage in this sort of increasingly complex and changing sort of insurance world. So that's the roadmap, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about the cyber threat landscape. Dave?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Wong. So I'm here to provide an overview of the cyber threat landscape. But I just wanted to start a little bit by describing FireEye a little bit. So we're a leading provider of cybersecurity services, technology, and threat intelligence. I'm on the cybersecurity consulting side, so the services arm, which is a company called Mandiant, and like Paul was saying earlier, we primarily help companies respond to security incidents and help them prevent them. But we also have a number of technologies that we sell that can identify and block cyber attacks. And I wanted to point out that those technologies were, from a cyber standpoint, one of the first technologies that got certified with the Safety Act back in 2015. And then the third piece of our company focuses really on threat intelligence. So we really look at trying to know the enemy so we can better help our customers defend against attacks. And that's where I wanted to start off today, which is just a very high-level overview of what we're seeing with the cyber threat landscape. So, first of all, I should point out that, the cyber threat landscape changes very dynamically. The threats that we were seeing 5 years ago are not the same as what we're seeing today. One of the things, the first point there is that the adversary behavior is more complex than ever. We're seeing some cyber criminals that have the ability of attacks that are very similar to what we're seeing from nation states. There are a lot of mercenaries out there, and what we describe as hackers for hire, that do work on behalf of criminals, of terrorists, as well as nation states, which makes it very difficult for us to try to identify and attribute like who's behind a cyber attack, and that's something you'll see whether you're looking at election hacking or terrorist hacking, and you're trying to figure out who the attacker is. It's getting more and more difficult to attribute to who that attacker is. The third bullet point I wanted to touch upon there was that there's what we're calling the professionalization of cybercrime. So you're starting to see the underground market get more segmented. So there are these things called like dark web underground forums where you'll see criminals aggregate, and they're there with some of the nation state actors. They're there with some of those terrorists, where people buy and sell cyber weapons. They buy and sell data that they have stolen from companies, and so it's relatively easy for someone with a lot of money. You think a terrorist organization to just go into those underground forums, build up some trust and persona for themselves, and be able to get access to information, access to networks, as well as cyber weapons that they wouldn't be able to do before. And one of the things that I feel like we've been lucky with in the cybersecurity industry is that, and I say lucky, I mean relatively lucky, right? Most of the stuff that you see in the news, is theft of information, right? So it's theft of credit cards, theft of personal information, and while that's bad and it's what makes the news, what many of us in the cybersecurity industry are really concerned about is destructive activity. I think we saw some with the Sony attacks, with North Korea targeting some of Sony systems and basically wiping them. And now, while it's rare that happens, we do see malware with that capability, and we know that there are attackers that have access to those tools. So it's something that everybody's been monitoring very closely, and we're concerned about critical infrastructure as well as companies being targeted, and there be destructive malware launched against those systems. I wanted to speak briefly about some of the threat actors that we're seeing as well too. A lot of them are either coming out of major countries that we consider as adversaries, and they could be nation state sponsored, or they could be sort of mercenaries like I described. With China, where the attacks have gone back for over a decade. There's a lot of intellectual property theft. There are those mercenaries for hire that I mentioned, where we see them engage in extortion of companies, where they'll steal data and they'll say, if you don't give me $1 million, we're going to release that data and embarrass you, and you have to deal with all the regulatory liabilities associated with that. With Russia, it's a little bit different. We're seeing those a lot of espionage, election-related attacks both in the U.S. and other countries. One thing to note about Russia is that they tend to use a lot of tools that the criminals use, and they're intentionally trying to cover their tracks and make it more difficult for us to try to identify who they are. And if you think about some of the insurance coverages that we'll be talking about later, there's some challenges with trying to attribute attacks to Russia and some other countries. But in terms of destruction, the last two are probably where we have the most concern is with North Korea and Iran. We've seen evidence of them using malware to destroy systems. And the other thing is, like, they have a lot less to lose as well too in terms of country, right? They're going to be ones that push. They may launch some cyber attacks. In terms of one of 0 days is something that we hear customers ask about a lot. So what 0 days are essentially, like, these are vulnerabilities in systems that nobody knows about. And a lot of companies are concerned about 0 days, and I'm sort of here to tell you that, like, that wouldn't be my primary concern, because what we often see are attackers not necessarily using 0 days, right? Because once they use these, like, very rare weapons, they're never going to be able to use them again. And we also see that a lot of these attackers are trying to hide and cover who they are. So if they're using the same tools that other cyber criminals are, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for you to try to attribute it to terrorist activity or nation-state activity. We're running a little bit short on time, so one thing I just want to caution some of the audience about is we see almost all these threat actors moving upstream, and what I mean by that is, instead of attacking individual companies, what we see is them targeting core infrastructure where if they get access to those companies, it's going to have more of an impact, or if they get access to those companies, they're going to have access to more data. So if you are in an industry where you provide telecom services or IT services for a large number of appliances, those are the companies that we've seen get targeted just because of the sheer access that they have to, whether it's individual consumers or to businesses. I guess, Kevin, I'm gonna move it over to you just to stay on time.
Sure thing. Thanks, Dave. So on the physical security threat landscape, as with the cyber threats, there are a variety of potential threat actors as well as differing motivations. Some of these are ideologically based, whether what we would call foreign or domestic terrorists. Some are disgruntled employees or someone involved with a family or romantic conflict. Mental illness is often a factor. And unfortunately, we sometimes simply can't identify the motivation for one of these attacks. But the diversity of the potential actors and the motivations that they're working from really adds to the challenges of ensuring physical security. The most common modes of attack for an incident of the scale that we're really concerned with in this context are generally going to be firearms, mass shooting events, some sort of an explosive device, and more recently and increasingly vehicular assaults, so-called vehicular ramming incidents. The targets for physical threat actors are, of course, somewhat different than those of the cyber threats. And generally, it's any location where large numbers of people gather could be a target. The more open the location is to the public, the more susceptible that it may be to something bad happening. As you see in the news headlines, entertainment venues, educational facilities, offices, and other workplace environments, public transportation hubs, houses of worship, these are all the sorts of places that have been targets of large-scale attacks. I should probably also have listed on this slide critical infrastructure facilities as a target category. Various industries have been cognizant of threats to their critical infrastructure for some time and have adopted generally effective protective measures. So thankfully, we haven't seen successful large-scale attacks on critical infrastructure in this country, but there have been attempted attacks and plots that have been interrupted before they could actually be carried out. So it's something that certainly deserves our continued attention. Let's see, there we go. So this slide lists some of the more significant attacks of each of these kinds that I just mentioned. I'm not going to run through all of these now. Unfortunately, most of them are probably familiar to you. As I noted just a moment ago, the backgrounds, motivations, and objectives behind each of these attacks vary. It's really not one group, ideology, or root cause at work. I listed September 11th as its own category for a variety of reasons. That was a particularly complicated plot, and the scale of the harm seemed to warrant a separate mention. And then finally, I included the Metcalf substation incident as an example of attack on critical infrastructure. In this case, for those of you who aren't well acquainted with this, gunmen attacked and severely damaged a major electric substation in the PG&E service territory. And while the attack did not result in significant service interruptions, it was noteworthy because of the sophistication with which it was carried out, the financial cost of the damage that was inflicted, and then the subsequent industry responses. What happened there was that the attackers came in, they cut communications cables to interrupt situational awareness prior to the shooting, and there were indications that they had meaningful knowledge of the configuration and operation of the substation. 17 transformers were shot and badly damaged, leaking huge quantities of cooling oil. The cost of the damage to the facilities has been reported to be over $15 million, and PG&E subsequently committed to spending over $100 million to enhance security at its various facilities. While initial reports suggested that the attack may have been conducted by terrorists of some kind, there were theories that perhaps this was a trial run for larger attacks. The subsequent investigation concluded that it was likely an insider, but nevertheless, it's an example of the kind of attack that can be conducted against infrastructure facilities. So this slide touches on some of the challenges pertaining to physical security and the tools to address them. By their nature, public spaces are inherently hard to secure. You're trying to attract and accommodate the public, often in large numbers, and also trying to keep them safe. You've got a lot of people and materials coming and going, and many of whom you don't know much or anything about, and it creates a tough security environment. As in other contexts, this sort of sets up a tension between functionality that you want and security that you need that sometimes work at odds with one another. But there are established and evolving best practices in the area, some of which are listed here. And these are really the kinds of things that can be candidate for Safety Act certification or designation. So moving on to get us into the Safety Act itself. The Safety Act is not in itself a cyber or physical security defensive tool, but a Safety Act award is predicated upon adoption and deployment of best practices. So it definitely does have the effect of promoting cyber and physical security. And importantly, the Safety Act offers significant protections to owners and operators of systems and facilities that could be the target of an attack, as well as to those who provide security services and technologies to protect such systems and venues. I'll briefly mention that over 1,000 Safety Act approvals have been granted by DHS since the Act's inception. Majority of these, especially early on, pertain to physical security technologies, systems, locations, but an increasing number of the applications relate to cybersecurity tools and systems. So with that, I'll hand it over to Paul for some background on the Safety Act and an overview of how it works.
Great, thank you, Kevin. All right, so what is this crazy Safety Act thing? So right after the September 11th attacks, there were some important decisions in the New York State courts ruling that defendants, including airlines, the Port Authority, and others, had a duty to protect the public from damages caused by these terrorists, even if it was with people with whom these entities had no contractual relationship. And so the court, for instance, found that the World Trade Center defendants owed a duty to the occupants to create and implement adequate fire safety measures. And that's for like an airline and the Port Authority for people that are in these buildings. So there was no contractual relationship. And the scope of the liability is just extraordinary, billions and billions of dollars, and frankly, company-ending liability even for these types of institutions. And so Congress is very concerned that the security industry in the United States would just dry up, because if companies are facing this kind of liability, they might just move to other markets. And that would ultimately make the country a lot less secure. And so they passed the Safety Act. And so this law, the Support Antiterrorism by Fostering Effective Technologies Act, Safety Act, what this is intended to do is to foster the continued innovation in security in the United States. So going to the next slide, quick overview, and we're going to talk about each of these things in greater detail. The Safety Act provides legal protections where a qualified anti-terrorism technology, or a QATT, has been deployed. in response to an act of terrorism. So we're going to talk about what a QATT is in a minute, and we'll also talk about what an act of terrorism is. The Department of Homeland Security has an Office of Safety Act Implementation. They are the ones that are responsible for implementing the act. They've issued regulations and have been very active, and as Kevin said, about 1,000 technologies have been certified or designated or received another type of Safety Act award. There's different types of awards, and we'll talk about those three. They're listed here. We'll talk about those in greater detail shortly. And maybe even most importantly, there's significant practical benefits associated with the Safety Act, and we'll discuss that later as well. So let's talk about what types of awards there are. There's three, your technology, your service, your equipment, your method. It can be certified. It can receive one of three levels of protection under the Act. These are all QATTs. It can receive a certification. It can receive a designation, and or a development, testing, and evaluation designation, which is more for sort of relatively new, sort of relatively untested technologies and services. Most companies are primarily interested in either the certification or the designation because they, as Kevin said earlier, suggested a sort of a best practice of sorts and a consistency in sort of the performance of those best practices and data to support that. And the certification is higher than the designation. You'll see the sort of language that's associated with this type of with each type of award, and then we're going to talk about the practical and the legal benefits of each in a little bit. What's nice is that it literally is a stamp of sort of good housekeeping, if you will. You literally, when you get one of these awards, you literally get these stamps. We did not just create these little logos. This is literally the stamp that you get from DHS, and you can stamp it all of your documents and all of your technology. And it's a nice way to communicate to the public, if you want to communicate this, that you've got a practice that's certified by the government agency in the country that is responsible for trying to protect us all, the Department of Homeland Security. So what is a qualified anti-terrorism technology? Well, here's the definition, and you'll see that it's really quite broad. It's any product, equipment, a service, device, or technology designed for security purposes and designated as such by the Secretary. So it's a discretionary designation. And what does this actually mean? So it means that it's more than just technology. It goes beyond technology to include services or even a combination of services and technology. So the definition is very broad, and there are no limits that would exclude cybersecurity technology or programs. So cyber attacks are considered to be covered by an act of terrorism, and DHS has designated not only cybersecurity services and technologies offered to others, but also internal security programs, internal cybersecurity and internal physical security programs. And so the next slide kind of is a launching point for us to talk about some of the examples of things that are covered by the QATT. And so as Kevin said, for years, the principal focus of the Safety Act was on physical security, and he's going to talk about an example of that with respect to the National Football League. And before I hand it over to Kevin, I'm going to just talk about one of the more recent examples of a Safety Act award, which is a major electric and gas utility company received an award that we handled their application Hunton did, and it's an umbrella. The technology was basically their umbrella cybersecurity risk management and governance program. It is very broad, covers the entire company. It covers generation, transmission, and distribution, electricity, gas, and nuclear, and specifically addresses their governance, strategy, policies, training, and incident response programs. So it's in many ways sort of similar to the protection you might associate with the sort of security protections associated with a physical thing like an NFL stadium. And that, I think, was sort of the analogy that DHS was drawing from as it reached out to the energy sector, in particular the utility sector, to try to encourage the use of or encourage these companies to apply for Safety Act protections. And one of the things that you'll hear later on is that this is not an adversarial process. This is a collaborative process with DHS. They do scrutinize things very carefully, but they're there to work with us. Kevin, do you want to talk about the NFL and NBA and Major League Baseball?
Yeah, sure. As Paul just noted, what we have listed here is an example of one of many certifications that have been granted for NFL, NBA, MLB, and other sports and entertainment venues. in the same way that for the major electric and gas utility, it was sort of a sweeping, overarching certification for their cybersecurity risk management program. Similarly, these certifications, and the one listed here is for the Buffalo Bills, are an application of the sort of best practices for the securing these types of large public venues, and it's focused on, as indicated here, the physical and electronic security equipment, tools, emergency planning processes, training of personnel, and it covered in scope the entire stadium property. So it's all of the seating areas, the suites, the gates through which people are coming and going, loading docks through which deliveries are coming and going, locker rooms, basically the entire physical facility itself is covered within the scope of the certification. So it's a good indicative example of the kinds of physical security certifications that have been granted to a number of recipients.
And Dave, would you like to jump in and talk about FireEye's certification?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, FireEye provides products and technologies to help detect cyber attacks. So one of the underlying technologies is what we call our multi-vector virtual execution engine, and basically what that is as files are introduced into a network. So think about like when you receive a piece of email and it might have an attachment in it. What we do is we have technology that inspects that and essentially, pushes a bunch of buttons and then runs it in a sandbox in an environment, and then it's able to detect if it's a malicious document that's intended to cause harm. And so, we had our technology evaluated by the U.S. government, and we received the certification back in 2015. I think we were, one of the first, companies to get the certifications, even though the Safety Act has been around for almost 20 years now. But back in 2015 is when cyber companies started, getting into the process. And, for us, it was initially looking at the liability protections, not only for FireEye, but also for our customers that would be using our technologies as well, too. And, a lot of those, just happen to, be in the federal government or defense contractor space.
Thanks, Dave, and I'll just jump in to add a couple things here. So I think that these examples are sort of illustrative and they're helpful because, and in particular, the last example with Dave is that not only was that a groundbreaking sort of Safety Act award because it was one of the first cyber ones, but it also underscores the fact that the Safety Act applies to technologies and services offered by third parties. So it's not just your own security. In fact, the vast majority of applications and awards, I think, are actually for third parties that provide services to others. And as Dave alluded to at the very end of his statement a minute ago, the way the legal protections work is that if your company, if FireEye is offering a Safety Act certified product, then the purchaser, their client, the purchaser of that product and the service actually benefit from the same legal protections. So those legal protections extend to the buyer of FireEye's services, and that's true for any vendor that offers services, whether it's for physical security or cybersecurity, to a client. So moving on, sort of a quick administrative piece for those that are trying to get CLE credit. The attendance affirmation code for this program is H@0000 #5, number 5. So please write this down to complete the attorney verification form. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move on to the practical benefits and hand it back over to Kevin, Dave, and now to Bruce.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so before Paul gets into the sort of specific statutory benefits provided under the Act, we wanted to sort of frame out what we view to be some of the very significant practical benefits of Safety Act certification or designation. As Paul mentioned earlier, a product or service that's received certification or designation will be listed at the applicant's discretion. You can opt in or out on the DHS website. And then you're able to use that Safety Act seal in the promotion of your product or services. And as Paul mentioned, it is literally a seal of approval that's issued by DHS, which can be valuable. I think in this way, Safety Act provides a very valuable nutshell or shorthand sort of explanation that your products or services are, in essence, best in class when it comes to cyber or physical security. By their nature, these things can be complicated and cumbersome to explain in detail, but a Safety Act approval allows you to indicate to important constituencies that you have a program or technology that has been carefully scrutinized by a federal government agency with core responsibilities for security and found them to meet or exceed best practices. And so this can be very effective when dealing with a board of directors or shareholders, regulators, elected officials, customers, and a host of other important constituencies that often have questions about this subject matter but are not necessarily perfectly situated to understand the answers. So this is a nice way to sort of have that conversation, or at least to start it. It doesn't preclude a deeper dive with these audiences, but it's a nice way to open and close a conversation. It can also more sort of tangibly be very helpful in the context of litigation. If you do have a declared act of terrorism, then you enjoy these very powerful statutory protections that we're going to talk more about in a minute. But even in the absence of a declared act of terrorism, Safety Act certification or designation can be a very effective way to demonstrate that you've met what is going to be the relevant standard of care that would be in question in that case. And this is valuable both at the entity level but also at the director and officer level. So in my own thinking about Safety Act and talking about it with clients, I think that the practical benefits of certification or designation equal or in some ways exceed the specific statutory protections that it affords, as powerful as those are.
Yeah, I would add to this, is Bruce Cohen. One of your constituencies are the people who price your insurance coverage and control the scope of the coverage that you have. So, this we'll delve into this in more depth. But this, crosses both the physical and cyber realms of risk management and insurance management that I think has just substantial benefits that are probably underappreciated. Looking more broadly at the practical benefits, these are all table stakes, right? In addition to proving your risk profile, we've seen clients embrace this because of the marketing benefits that Paul was really calling out. The ability to secure financing more quickly than they might otherwise, and simply to get their product or service to market more quickly because of those risk protections, which always come into the math when you're going to market. And we've seen this in action as we put our heads together with clients to strategize about how to manage and control risk, ring fence it, and the Safety Act is an incredibly effective way to do that.
Yeah, this is David Wong. I just wanted to add briefly that while FireEye initially got this Safety Act certification, and our initial goals were from a risk management and liability protection standpoint, I think what we learned over the last 4 years was that just from a practical business standpoint, a lot of our customers do value the Safety Act certification. It was a very simple way for us to explain that our product works as intended. It's been thoroughly tested by the U.S. government. And, I think what was a little bit surprising to us was, not only did this resonate with U.S. clients in the defense industrial base, and typical clients, but we also found that, even some of our international clients that, would never benefit from the liability protection, they did sort of see this as a quality approval, right? So, very much like, USDA beef is recognized worldwide, or, other countries will look at drugs that are FDA certified. Like this Safety Act, means something, beyond the borders of the United States as well too.
Great. I think that's back over to me then. So now we're going to talk about the legal protections. So the legal protections of the Safety Act are extraordinary, but they only kick in if there is a declared act of terrorism. So we need to talk about what act of terrorism is as defined under the law and what it means to be declared, right? So on this slide, we've actually got the requirements of act of terrorism, and you'll see that they're actually quite broad, and the bar does not appear to be that high, at least on paper. So 1, it's got to be unlawful. 2, the act has got to cause harm. The type of harm that's contemplated is quite broad. And then the operative sort of activity is got to be intended to cause mass destruction. It doesn't even say that it caused mass destruction, but that it was intended to cause mass destruction. The key thing here, though, is that it's got to be declared an act of terrorism by the DHS Secretary. Federal government doesn't generally like to admit that an act of terrorism took place under its watch. And so there's a political dimension to it, there's a policy dimension to it, there's legal dimensions, there's legal implications associated with it. So it's, and DHS has not issued particularly specific guidance about when it is and that the Secretary must declare something to be an act of terrorism. So you really can't count on this happening, even though certainly if something on the order of 9/11 happened again or something of that magnitude, then I think that it's certainly quite possible that DHS would in fact declare that to be an act of terrorism. We have actually questioned DHS about this, and they said that the reason why it hasn't come up more is frankly because DHS hasn't been confronted with the question, because generally when these things have happened, and there aren't a lot of acts that would even be close to qualifying, there wasn't Safety Act technology or services that were at issue. So they weren't really confronted with the question. I think that as more and more technologies and services are getting certified, the likelihood of this coming up is certainly going to increase. One thing that's also very notable about this is that the definition of act of terrorism does not include any political or ideological element as a motive. That is very different from what we have in the criminal code and what we in this country tend to think of as terrorist activity. And so that's important, because that means that it doesn't have to be ISIS or Al-Qaeda or one of the sort of well-known terrorist organizations that commits this act. Who commits it really is not material under the Safety Act. So it could be a nation-state actor, it could be a criminal hacker, it could be a criminal physical threat. It's really quite broad. It's not limited to the traditional sort of well-known terrorists, terrorists outside of the United States and inside of the United States. The legal protections vary depending on, so if you have an act of terrorism, the legal protections vary depending on whether you have a certification, a designation, or the DTE testing sort of Safety Act award. I'm going to just talk for a minute about the incredibly powerful legal protection you get if you have a certification in the event of an act of terrorism that's declared by DHS, and that is that the general contractor defense applies. This gives FireEye, the utility company, the Buffalo Bills, this presumption of immunity from liability for claims, both federal and state, covered by the Safety Act. And so it's an affirmative defense that immunizes the holder of that Safety Act certification from these liability claims. And it's clear from the legislative history that Congress intended for this to be very broad. The statute itself is very broadly worded, and DHS takes the position that it applies to both state and federal law, sort of liability laws. And so it's really very, very broad. And now I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Lorie, to talk about the legal protections in the event of an act of terrorism for companies that hold a designation.
Great. So thank you, Paul, and it's great to be with you all this afternoon. So let's talk, well, wait a minute. All right, so here we are. Sorry, get the right slide here. I want to just point you to this slide, which is slide 32, and it gives an overview, a summary of all of the legal protections and how they work. So you can see on the right margin there that the green and blue designations or stickers, good housekeeping seals of approval from DHS, apply and have significant protections in that lower box. So, for example, liability here is limited to the amount of insurance that DHS says that the applicant, called the seller in the regulations, the amount of insurance that DHS says that you have to have. So this is third-party liability insurance, and it is something that the DHS looks at in terms of the application. It assesses the insurance that the applicant has, and it uses that to determine how much insurance the company needs to have to protect itself against third-party liability, and then that is used as the cap on the amount of liability that the applicant, the party that has obtained a certification or designation by the DHS, how much their liability will be capped at. So the first thing is this limit on liability, but there are many other benefits that come from this. So one thing that's important to understand is that if you get either a certification or any of these designations, you're limited, you as the seller, the company that got the certification or designation from DHS, you're exposed to only one cause of action if there is a certified act of terrorism. One cause of action, it has to be brought in federal court, so exclusive federal court jurisdiction. There is no exposure to punitive or exemplary damages. The recovery would have to be for some kind of compensatory damages. There's no exposure to prejudgment interest, and any recovery would be reduced by the amount of collateral source recovery that you would get from some other source, for example, insurance. So these insurance and liability limitations apply under the regulations in quote, in perpetuity to all sales of that QATT. The other thing to keep in mind is that the cause of action must be brought against the seller, in other words, the company that has the certification or designation. It also applies, the cause of action cannot be brought, I should say, against the vendors, the contractors, the subcontractors, the suppliers of the company with the certification or designation. So these are really huge, powerful protections, and of course they affect how underwriters, as we'll talk about in a minute, how underwriters should view the risk that the company poses in buying the insurance. There is this additional protection that Paul mentioned. If you get the certification, the highest level of protection or I guess good housekeeping seal of approval. And in addition to all the protections that are identified in the box below, the big box, you also get the benefit of the government contractor defense. And this applies to anyone, any company that has a certification. You don't have to be a government contractor. It's just using the common law protections that the courts have developed for government contractors to define the scope of that immunity. So this is a really big deal, and it can only be, it's a rebuttable presumption, but it can only be overturned or disregarded if the claimant, meaning the plaintiff or plaintiffs, can show by clear and convincing evidence that somehow the applicant deceived DHS in applying for its certification. So this is a very high bar. And this is a huge, broad defense, and it provides this additional protection for those companies that receive a certification. So Paul, do you want to talk about the application process?
Yes. Sorry, I had you on mute. Okay, thanks very much, Lorie. I'm going to do this very quickly so we have time for Lorie and Bruce to talk about the cyber insurance market. These are just two slides that talk about the process by which you can seek a Safety Act award. And you can take a look at these yourselves after the event or after this panel. But I'll make a couple of points. One, it's a very collaborative process, not an adversarial process with DHS. They're trying to make this work. They're trying to leverage this tool that they have to encourage better security practices, and they will work with you. Two, they want to try and do as much as they can, and you can, sort of in the pre-application stage. And so this back and forth between DHS and the applicant is real, and they will provide feedback even before you enter like the sort of formal process. These two slides here actually are just example slides that are examples that relate to the enterprise cybersecurity risk management and governance certification that we helped a major utility company to get. And we included this example just because it reflects a more complex than normal application. And even this, you can see, is a pretty manageable process that was, like I said, not adversarial. The other thing is that DHS moves fast on this stuff, so they try to get as much work through before a formal pre-application or application is submitted, because once the application goes in, they're under very, very tight deadlines. They came in a tremendous criticism from Congress about 3 or 4 years ago for not meeting this 120-day deadline, for not moving things through fast enough. So they're very serious about it. They will try to get you to reduce your application to sort of bite-sized pieces. So they may take a very broad-scoped application, reduce it to, or suggest that you sort of break it up into several different pieces, so they're not trying to boil the ocean. That makes it easier for you, easier for them, and actually more likely that you're going to get some pieces of those things at a certification level, not just a designation level. So it is advisable to work with them on this, and they will move it along fast, and you're going to have to respond fast to their questions once that 120-day clock begins. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce and Lorie to talk about the cyber insurance market and best practices on insurance coverage.
Sure. I'm going to open this up and then turn it over to Bruce. So let's see, get to the next slide here. So we've talked about this, but the backdrop on talking about insurance and why cyber insurance is such a big part of this is the DHS perspectives on insurance. So DHS, as part of the application process, will look at a company's insurance program, specifically its third-party liability insurance. But we've learned from making these applications on behalf of clients that the DHS is really only worried about certain kinds of insurance. In fact, when Paul and I had a conversation about a year ago, well, actually it's probably 18 months ago now, with regard to the utility that we were talking about earlier. I wanted to put in a lot of, or all of the company's different liability insurances, and basically DHS has taken the position that it's really only interested in and maybe, from my perspective, equipped to evaluate the CGL insurance that a company has, the comprehensive general or commercial general liability insurance, and it's cyber insurance, and potentially with regard to utilities, in that case you might have some kind of nuclear liability insurance. But specifically then we're talking here probably for most applicants about their CGL insurance and their cyber insurance, because they don't understand and they're not looking at directors and officers and other kinds of liability insurance. The other thing, and Bruce will talk about this, is that because you have these very significant limitations that are summarized here once again in the second major bullet there, this affects or should affect, from our perspective, how underwriters are looking at a company's exposure and risk when they're underwriting coverage. So Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lorie. Yeah, it's interesting that the DHS world of insurance is much different than the commercial realm that we operate in every day, and that's what I'll try to focus on here. And I'd start with a comment that, at a high level, certainly cyber insurance is the most dynamic and fast-evolving risk area in our business. I like what Dave Wong said about this professionalization of cybercrime. I don't like what he said, but I like how he said it. Just the escalation in the ransomware demands in particular, and related crimes that we see, has just entered a whole new realm. In the slide in front of you, you'll see just how the healthcare industry was impacted by one event to the tune of multi-billion-dollar impacts. And unfortunately, this is a global event which is progressing, morphing, evolving into something even worse. These so-called viruses capable of adding what they term as tumors into scans, complicating what doctors are diagnosing. So all sorts of potential, not just for dollar damages, but and real damages, physical damages, but huge liabilities that come with that. We've got sort of a physical realm that Kevin talked about and a cyber realm that's taking on increasing importance, but there are other areas that are impacted, like directors and officers, which we'll speak to. But looking at the ransomware event, which is, in terms of dollar terms, the biggest one, here are all the sorts of things that come into play, these impacts to a business, and they go beyond this, but it's not only loss of your systems, but cost to get your system up and running. And invariably, what we find with our clients, unfortunately, these events happen over Christmas or over the weekend, and that's unfortunately part of the cyber criminal playbook, if you will. There's reputational damage, there's business interruption damage, even this notion of bricking. You may have heard that term, making physical equipment inoperable because of the impacts of these cyber breaches. So it's not just the insurance company provision of coverage that protects an organization, but all these other things, the security policies, the procedures, how proactive is an organization, how resilient are they, are they doing tabletop exercises, do they have their partners in place, their law firms, their forensic partners in place to respond to an event. And then, by the way, these attributes you see here in terms of what an organization must consider are those things that insurance underwriters, I should say, will use to price their coverage and determine the scope of coverage they offer. Now, there's a whole regulatory aspect to this as well, which we've been talking about, and layers of it. You've got state laws, famously the California Consumer Privacy Act, which people are just getting their arms around as that approaches coming into effect on January 1st of this upcoming year. You've got international laws. It's rare for us, at least, having a client that's not impacted to at least some degree by sort of the international or global regulatory landscape. But this is certainly not an exhaustive list. The regulatory oversight is moving very quickly, expanding very quickly. Fortunately, there is an insurance response or support for this. So far, it hasn't been blocked, if you will, by legislators. There's an argument that there is a moral hazard, some will say, to ensuring such things, regulatory fines and the like. You see some of the more notable examples, the GDPR, widely reported Marriott, British Airways, Google fines. Those have impacted the cyber insurance market substantially, but it's a very resilient market. It's growing quickly. There's more and more providers of this insurance. The coverage itself is evolving as the sophistication of the breaches and the attacks evolve. But again, a whole nother aspect and layer to the cyber threat, the cyber aspect, and so the potential application of the Safety Act. So how does this play out, in the insurance realm, the insurance market? As we're seeing that there's a relevance much beyond companies that work as contractors to the federal government. It's anybody with a responsibility to the public for protecting people against terrorist events. The general liability coverage realm is very much related to the physical security threats that Kevin Jones was describing. And you have the cyber E&O elements to the Safety Act where that comes into play in your insurance protections. And what I would say is the directors and officers claims derived from physical and cyber events that alleged negligence by a firm's leadership, that's a very real thing. So whether DHS likes it or not, that's a very real circumstance and consequence of an event. So all these things come into play in terms of presenting your Safety Act credentials in your insurance renewal process. And our clients that have these credentials, be it a designation, certification, this comes into play in terms of how you go to market, how you structure your program, what limits you acquire. And it's very important to tell that story. If you have that Safety Act story to tell, you submit that into the market. You tell about those protections. Not all insurance underwriters understand them, certainly outside the Mid-Atlantic area, but you show them your sample contracts, the type of work that you're doing, and you even push pricing, and we've been able to do that for our clients to actually demonstrate these sort of outside insurance program protections that come in the form of Safety Act protections. I think, Lorie, you suggested that you look at what's provided under the Safety Act is actually retention, and insurance buyers can think of buying insurance really on top of that. I think we're bumping up against time.
Right. So one other point just to make really quickly is that I think one aspect that we see clients not really understanding, or maybe not understanding the need to discuss with their broker and perhaps their underwriters, is, and Dave mentioned this early on, the involvement of state actors, and specifically how that may affect war exclusions and the interplay in insurance these days between war exclusions, which can be very broadly worded, and terrorism exclusions. So you want to look at those and make sure that you still have the coverage after the exclusions are taken into account that you think you're buying.
It's well said, Lorie.
Okay, I think we're pretty much at the top of the hour, so I think we'll close the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. And if you have any questions for any of us, our contact information is on the PowerPoint, and I think that this webinar and this recording will be circulated to all of you that registered. Have a great day.